Okay, I'll call this meeting to order. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Call the meeting to order. Councillor Moore and Deputy Mayor Coughlin at the special meeting of the Council of the Township of Springwater of August 24, 2020 come to order at 5 p.m. All those in favor? Carried. Due to COVID-19, Council is taking the necessary steps to limit in-person meetings. As such, Council will be participating in the meeting electronically, and I'm here physically along with a couple of senior staff appropriately physically distanced. Residents are provided with the following options to watch or listen to the Council meeting. You can watch the meeting live on the Township website at www.springwater.ca. Listen to the meeting live from a telephone or a cellular device by calling 647-558-0588 and using the ID 865-7159-2036 with the pound sign. And this option is available during the meeting. And for those unable to watch the live stream, they can review the meeting at their convenience by watching the video on the Township's YouTube channel. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest tonight, Council? All right. Seeing none, I now call upon Gregory Bender of WSP Consultants, joining us electronically via Zoom with a presentation on the Cannabis Production Review Study. Gregory, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you virtually to talk about the Cannabis Production Review Study. And just before I begin, if I could just get a nod or somebody to confirm that you have the presentation in front of you so I can begin.
Yes, we were provided with the presentation, so I believe we all should have it.
Perfect, thank you very much. So this is the first meeting as part of this assignment, and really, and I'll go through the overall agenda with you. The purpose of the meeting, I want to talk about sort of the legislative context within which we are to work and undertake the study, looking at some of the existing tools that the township has at your disposal to guide various particular issues associated with cannabis, any particular options for consideration, sort of the best practices review we're going to undertake. And then I would say probably from my perspective to walk you through a bit of a survey and to ask all of you questions and to get feedback, because we want to use your feedback to help sort of establish a narrative for the study and to understand what sort of the major issues that you see in your constituency as part of sort of cannabis production in the township. So the purpose of this meeting is to present all of you with the study's initial findings and provide an opportunity for council input on sort of where we are in the study and some overall direction that we'll be seeking. We also want to understand your input as it relates to some questions that we'll be asking. Because it will form part of the recommendations that we'll be developing throughout the study. So just in terms of some introduction, I'm sure you're well aware of why we're here today and why the study is being undertaken, but an interim control bylaw was passed on June 3rd, 2020 for 1 year to freeze sort of the establishment of new cannabis facilities within the township, specifically within industrial and agricultural zones. And this study is to really understand sort of the existing local context, what's the sort of federal provincial policy framework, and sort of best practices to help us build sort of options for you to consider, as well as sort of perhaps some recommendations once we get there. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the Cannabis Act and some legislative context that will guide us through this process. And the Cannabis Act was passed in 2018. It established federal regulations for the production, possession, and sale of cannabis. But it does permit provinces and gives them the authority to regulate the use, distribution, and sale. Federal and provincial requirements related to licensed facilities are intended to ensure that there are minimal or no adverse effects on surrounding land uses. And again, we'll talk about what that might look like. It does regulate matters such as required notice to local authorities, so government, fire, or police, or RCMP, physical and personnel security and good production practices. It does prohibit any licensed activity in a dwelling, permits indoor-outdoor cultivation, requires reasonable measures to prevent the escape of odors and pollen from indoor areas, and requires physical and personal security measures. which can deal with fencing or other security measures. So that's sort of the federal context. And then really related to what we're going to be doing as part of the study is that we need to work within sort of the land use framework that we have in Ontario. And that would include the provincial policy statement as sort of one piece of legislation, one piece of provincial policy. And what you'll see as we move further down the tree of legislation or provincial policy is that it's sort of the last you hear about of cannabis, right? So provincial policy, again, just to provide you some sort of my thoughts on this, it doesn't speak to cannabis at all. We have heard as part of some of the other work that we've done across the province on cannabis production reviews is that cannabis production has been seen as a normal farm practice and should be treated as such. So many would say that it should be treated as an agricultural use, and that's sort of where it stops. I will say, as part of the numerous public engagement opportunities that we've had and worked with other municipalities across the province, is that it's not always seen as that. And in many other municipalities where there's significant numbers of greenhouses, certainly with all year growing, it's a different impact than, say, outdoor with one growing season as an example. So just to paint a little bit of a picture, so the provincial policy statement, as I mentioned, does not speak specifically to cannabis. It does speak to agricultural uses and does speak to on-farm diversified uses, which as far as we're told, provincial policies that this is how cannabis should be reviewed and contemplated within the provincial policy framework. The growth plan also does not speak to cannabis as a particular or specific use. It does speak to agricultural uses. And as I mentioned, because cannabis is seen as a crop, it's typically considered as a normal farm practice and therefore as an agricultural use. I'm trying to paint a bit of a picture as where we'll be going with this, but from a provincial policy standpoint, it will need to be treated as an agricultural use. But there are certain policies within the PPS or the growth plan that speak to interfaces, right? So interfaces with settlement areas, other land uses, other sensitive land uses. But just to be candid, the nice thing about getting federal legislation to guide cannabis, but then not having any provincial legislation to guide cannabis, puts municipalities in a bit of an awkward position because there's actually there's sort of a gap in direction. So what we've been doing is looking at some of the policies in provincial policy that speak to, again, mitigation, speak to minimal impacts on sensitive land uses. Say for a typical agricultural use, you would have minimum distance separation formula, which is very difficult to apply to a cannabis production use, but can be used to guide mitigative techniques, and I'll get into that in a minute. So with that, you have your provincial policy, but you also have a municipal guide to cannabis legislation. It was prepared to help guide municipalities sort of develop bylaws related to guiding cannabis and land use management. It does talk about individual licensing for a number of plants, and talks about how how growing outdoor plants can be undertaken. Talks about permits or licenses required for a certain scale of growth for limited growing, and talks about large-scale production as well. It does identify policy options for various municipalities, and it talks about allowing activities to occur within certain land use regulations as an agricultural industrial activity, depending on what's being proposed. It explicitly identifies activities within existing permitted use categories. So again, to be permitted only in specified locations that the municipality would permit. And also talks about identifying activities within existing permitted use categories. So whether it's an exception for existing cannabis production operations that were established under the medical cannabis regime, which is a little bit different. And again, I'm trying to paint a bit of a picture on, what guidance there is or limited guidance that there is for municipalities to develop their own framework. Again, not to anyone's surprise, the County of Simcoe's OP doesn't speak to cannabis production. Again, if you're using the same or tone that is established by provincial policy, it can be considered an agricultural use. Same with your existing official plan and zoning bylaw. There's nothing that specifically speaks to cannabis, so it's very difficult for the municipality to impose anything on a cannabis production facility because you don't have anything to help guide you. So some of the tools, in addition to land use policy, that you have particular tools enabled under the Planning Act or other pieces of legislation to guide whatever it relates to, whether it have particular impacts on adjacent land. So one of the bylaws that you have at your disposal, which you do have, is the property standards, or the Clean Safe Properties bylaw. It does establish minimum requirements for residential properties, and can be expanded, provided you undertake something like that, to include other types of uses. It can prohibit property conditions which pose or constitute an undue or unreasonable hazard or risk to the life or health of any person or on or about a property. So again, if you have particular issues with, say, anything that could impact a neighboring property as it relates to a particular standard established, that can be regulated. You also have site plan control. And site plan control really helps and gives teeth to sort of our land use planning framework, because it identifies what somebody promises that they're going to do and requires them to actually do it. So it also prohibits building permits from being issued until that site plan has been approved. Site plan control area, as you're well aware, within the township includes commercial employment institution areas, open space and industrial uses, and multi-res. It does not apply to lands designated for agricultural uses. Again, not to pull the curtain away, but presumably one of our recommendations is probably going to be amend your site plan control bylaw to include, it doesn't have to include all agricultural uses. You can specifically state cannabis as a particular use. Can also regulate a number of other sort of things that come up as it relates to cannabis that we've seen: lighting, fencing and security, ventilation locations, and parking. Ventilation, certainly as it relates to odor, is the most sort of the largest impact that we've heard throughout our research and the meetings that we've had. And certainly site plan control can't require somebody to identify an odor mitigation strategy, but through land use policy, you can guide that to then use that as a tool to require that. And a couple of things that I wanted to identify as part of this discussion that you should be aware is that it's important to recognize that the official plan and zoning bylaw, they're only able to guide the use of land and require additional studies to be undertaken. What I've mentioned before, and I will continue to mention throughout the study, is that the cultivation and production of cannabis is considered by the province to be a normal farm practice. So you almost have to strike a balance as to how far you can go to regulate something like cannabis, but recognizing where you have provincial policy to back you up as it relates to any mitigative impacts or impacts that need to be mitigated. That's something where the municipality can step in, and again, using property standards, using site plan control, or even municipal licensing as an option. But it has to be enabled in your official plan and zoning bylaw first. It's important that, as I mentioned, that your sort of recommendations, anything you might impose, sort of has to strike a balance, has to be based on good land use planning principles and sort of best practices, which we are going to undertake. One thing that should be made aware that many people are surprised about is that just because you put in an official plan policy or a zoning bylaw regulation doesn't mean that any issues are solved, because land use planning is not retroactive. It means that if anything's triggered by something new, whether it's an expansion or a new building, that's when, say, those policies or regulations could come into play. But it doesn't mean that just because you zone something today as with having required more sort of stricter land use regulations, doesn't mean they have to actually apply to them, because it's not retroactive. So some of the things that might be considered through this process as part of your official plan amendment, say, and one of them could be not even permitting them as of right. You could consider them on a case-by-case basis, provided they meet a number of different criteria. You can require site plan control. You can require cannabis production facilities to demonstrate how a number of different matters can be mitigated. And that's sort of what I touched on before as it relates to air quality, noise, lighting, setbacks or separation distances, fencing, waste management, traffic, and outdoor storage. Again, these are primarily the major sort of items that have come up that we've seen. And again, it gives the municipality the ability to regulate this, to give you some comfort that it'll be done properly and will meet the municipality's requirements. But with that, you also have to implement them through official plan policy, and one of those is your zoning bylaw. So again, adding a definition for cannabis production facility that, again, is based off of best practices, but meets sort of your local requirements is something that I would certainly, be recommending as part of this study. Looking at how cannabis production could be permitted within agricultural zones, or again, are they going to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis? And I think we'll need to talk a bit more about that. And looking at what sort of setbacks and minimal parcel sizes might be considered as part of this process. Understanding where air treatment control systems can be located, or anything like that. And then specifically identifying provisions for outdoor storage, screening, fencing, parking, signage, and lighting. But again, there are a number of other tools that you'll probably have to update as part of this, and that would include your property standards bylaw, your site plan control bylaw, again, related to lighting and screening and landscaping, where access is to be located. As part of your property standards, you can include provisions related to odor. It's just a matter of how you enforce that. But again, getting something that municipality can review as part of an application is certainly something that gives you more than what you currently have. Some municipalities consider odor control bylaws. They are very, very difficult to enforce. As you can appreciate, if I smelled something on my property and somebody came out to enforce that, it could be gone by the time somebody comes out. So it is very, very difficult to enforce, but it is yet another tool that the municipality has at their disposal to help mitigate some of the impacts from cannabis production. Municipal licensing isn't for every municipality. It depends on the number of facilities you may have or may be getting. Some municipalities consider licensing primarily because, as I mentioned, official plan policies and zoning regulations are not retroactive, but licensing is. So it's something that can be considered, again, if it makes sense. It is quite the undertaking to do, and then you obviously need people to enforce that as well. One of the other options that certainly is relatively inexpensive, but can reach a lot more people is public outreach and a campaign to support that. Having something on your website that talks about FAQs or frequently asked questions or any other supporting materials that people can read at their leisure to give them more context, just so they don't have to necessarily contact everybody if they see something that concerns them. They can do some of their own research to really sort of help them understand and give them sort of the basis for them to then contact the municipality. So that was just used to give you some context as to where we're going, where we're coming from, and some of the things that we will be considering as part of this process. But I did also talk about best practices, and that is obviously a very important exercise that we do for every planning assignment, because we want to understand what everybody else is doing, see, sort of try our best to pick what makes sense for the township of Springwater, because something that's identified in Edmonton or Barrie or wherever doesn't always apply in whatever municipality we're working on. So in this case, obviously the township of Springwater. So we're going to be looking at a number of municipalities, so including Oro-Medonte, Barrie, Bradford, West Gwillimbury, Lincoln and West Lincoln, Norfolk County as an example, and Halifax, Edmonton, and Town of Onaway. They've all implemented approaches or solutions that include revisions to their zoning bylaw, their official plan, site-specific lot and building requirements or other provisions, and as well as a licensing framework. And we're going to try and paint that picture for you when we come back to talk to you again, because we want to give you sort of the best picture that we can, to then use that as an opportunity to provide you with some recommendations for consideration. Again, that makes sense in the township of Springwater, not just necessarily because it was provided elsewhere. So as I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, I did obviously want to provide you with some context as to this, where we are in the study, what we're going to be doing, and what we will be coming forward to discuss with you at a later date. But what I wanted to really do today is talk to you about a number of questions, and township staff have prepared a public survey that's going to be posted on the township's website once the questions have all been confirmed. But what I wanted to do is share them with you tonight, this afternoon tonight, and get some of your input. And I'm not going to go through every single question, because some of them are perhaps irrelevant for many members of council in terms of, if you're a resident of the township and what area do you live in. But some of the things that I really want to talk about include the sort of, what are your concerns about cannabis production? Where perhaps they should be permitted. Should they be regulated more than agricultural use, and Should they be regulated more than traditional industrial use? Other questions that I want to talk to you about are, should they be permitted as of right, or should they go through a site-specific rezoning every single time? Because that gives the municipality and it allows them to go through a public process, which may not be there for, say, site plan or other particular bylaw conformity issues. Other particular things that we can talk about if we have time are what activity should be permitted within a cannabis use, and what activity should be permitted within industrial cannabis use, and what regulations you feel the township should put in place regarding cannabis production facilities, sort of to sum up everything that we've talked about. So I don't mean to direct counsel your worship, but that's sort of really concludes my presentation. I'm happy to walk everyone through, if that's okay, with some of the questions to open the floor, so to speak.
Thank you for the presentation. So before we go to question, can I have a mover and a seconder to receive the report to start to discuss it? Councillor Ma and Councillor Cabral. Thank you for the presentation. So let's open it up for discussion.
Okay, so if it's okay with you, I'm happy to lead, or I can just leave. I think if all members of council have the questions, you can just answer at your leisure. I'm happy to do whatever you would prefer.
Well, let's go for a round of questions first. I see Councillor Cabral's hand up, so proceed, Councillor Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. I just a couple of points actually. I'm curious to know why Clearview, who is adjacent to Springwater Township and does have a rather large marijuana or cannabis facility there. I believe they have more than one. There's another, I believe, outdoor one by the Nottawasaga River. It's not one of the ones that you're going to be reviewing, and I just would not want a distinct answer, but I would maybe like that to be a consideration, because they may have likely had that in place before they did anything, and they may have put something in place since then. So that's just one aspect. And I guess the other one I have is I kind of get the sense that looking to try and provide some form of guideline regulations to where these are going to be established and some conditions as to how they might be managed, understanding that they're federally licensed. And I would then think that they would be also federally inspected to make sure that they are adhering to their licensing criteria. But the question I guess I have is, since the province has basically said that it's a normal farming practice, along with OMAFRA, I'm just getting to that aspect of the odor and versus the right to farm. You know what I'm saying? Whereas if they're going to plant it and cultivate it, I would see that as any other crop or any other farming activity, that if it does create an odor, it's one of those so sad, too bad deals. So I'm kind of curious how that would actually work, if you could help me with that one, Gregory.
Okay, Gregory?
Certainly, through your worship. So if I miss anything, Councillor Cabral, just let me know. So with respect to Clearview, we worked with staff to identify sort of best practices, but we have no problem whatsoever adding Clearview. At the very least, just to talk about proximity and some of the stuff that they're doing. So the only reason it wasn't is because we didn't add it, but we're happy to. In terms of how cannabis production is managed, given that they're federally licensed and the province considers them as a normal farm practice, my best answer to that is that many municipalities that we've worked with have not been satisfied with the level of federal involvement that they've seen, and they don't feel like it was enough. So, for instance, a lot of our other clients have stated that they haven't been notified necessarily when certain licenses have been applied, and so that's why many of the municipalities are going through this exercise, because they feel like more intervention is needed. But that's a very fair comment. I think from a industry standpoint, I think even from some federal representative standpoint, is that's why it's there. But again, I think the reaction has been great, but it's felt that more intervention is needed and sort of more control from a municipal standpoint because of the real or perceived impacts from cannabis production that constituents are experiencing. And then as it relates to outdoor growing, very good question. We're working on that exact situation in the town of Lincoln right now. And the municipality has decided that they're going to regulate it in the very same way to that of indoor or through greenhouse growing. But recognizing that it is a bit of a different situation because, again, you're living in an agricultural area. There are often odors associated with agricultural uses. The perception is that this is still a crop, and that you're not having this, 3, 4, 5 growing seasons a year. It's one typically outdoors, so that it's felt like it should be treated a little bit differently. But it depends on the municipality. If you were to ask me, I still think that, until the minimum distance separation formula is updated, I think it needs to be treated a little differently, because minimum distance separation formula really deals with livestock manure storage, doesn't deal with anything else. But typically, a crop of corn, tomatoes don't have, an odor as significant as, say, significant yield of cannabis. Okay, if I covered everything, great.
Nope, you did there. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Hanna?
Thank you. I have two questions. The first for Mr. Bender, excuse me, the second for staff. Mr. Bender, we obviously talk about the fumes and the odors because that is something that we are hearing residents concerned about. I guess my question is the fumes or odors just simply offensive or considered to be offensive, but are there any health issues concerned with these odors? For example, on neighbors, public residents, we know all the impacts of thalidomide on babies at one time, but I just want to know if your study will be able to answer the public's questions about health concerns about the fumes or odors, and also what impact those odors would have on, say, livestock, bees, for example, birds. If it affects the bee population, is that an issue also that we're not aware of, but will you be able to answer those questions?
Through your worship, Councillor Hanna, would you like me to answer your question before you direct your question to staff?
Yes, because my question to staff is a different topic.
Sure. So this primarily is a land use planning assignment. We're dealing with sort of any potential recommendations that we would have to either amend or for the township to consider to guide cannabis production only through land use planning. However, we are undertaking a best practices review to try and, again, just paint a full picture. I can tell you that we haven't found anything with any sort of scientific backing to suggest that any of the odors would impact anyone's health, any livestock's health, any other species' health. However, in some of the public consultation that we've done throughout other municipalities, people have said that they have legitimate impacts. They can't go outside because they can't breathe, things of that sort. Again, that's just something that I've heard, but in all the research that we've done, that I've found, there's nothing to suggest that there is a scientific basis for any sort of unhealthy impacts, so it won't impact the health of livestock and bees and other members of the public.
Thank you. So basically, we just maybe have happy bees. My second question, Mayor, is to staff, and I just would like to hear from staff or anybody that can answer the question, if there are in fact any areas in Springwater Township where there are proposals or an interest in creating a agricultural grow off, if you like, or cannabis grow.
Okay, I'll direct that to CAO Schmidt. Oh, sorry. Director Spagnell, you're on the line. Can you address that, please?
Thank you, Alan, through to Councillor Hanna. Staff has received considerable interest to establishing cannabis production facilities across the municipality. It's to the point where we're almost receiving probably a call a week as to whether or not cannabis production facilities can be located within the agricultural areas of the municipality. Based on some instances, we have received, I wouldn't call them complaints, but they're more of FYIs that there might be some facilities of some nature operating in various places within the municipality. What those operations consist of really requires investigation to determine what it is that's being grown on site. So to answer your question, I don't know specifically if there are cannabis production facilities throughout the municipality or where they are. I know of a few locations where they've been, where staff have been advised that they may be cannabis production facilities, and enforcement has to go and investigate those. But I can tell you that there is significant interest in establishing these types of facilities within the municipality.
Thank you. Follow up?
Follow up?
Thank you. Director Spagnuolo, I've been asked about in Ward 5 particular, an area on Partridge Road near 400 Highway. Are you aware of any possible interest or applications in that area?
Director Spagnuolo?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Through you to Councillor Hanna. I am not aware of any applications for any facilities in that location. The one thing to point out is that the date of the moratorium essentially establishes a freeze on any new cannabis production facilities. If there was one to commence after the moratorium, it would be the township's position that they are not to commence because those represent new facilities. To Mr. Bender's point about retroactively establishing planning policy, if there was an ongoing operation somewhere which had a license that was issued by the federal government, the moratorium would not apply. It would essentially be grandfathered. So those types of questions would have to be investigated through bylaw enforcement. But for that specific property, I have not received any information to that effect.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Through to the gentleman there putting the presentation on there, Mr. Bender. Mr. Bender, you spoke about the odor and the smell. Can you elaborate about like the length of time that we would experience odor? Is it for a day? Is it for a week? I think that's very important to establish and find out. Can you comment any further on that?
Through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Ritchie, I don't have that information available this evening to discuss. I've been told it just depends on the crop growing conditions, you know, how warm the weather is, and especially if it's within, say, in a greenhouse or not. Sort of like there's a number of different factors that play into that, and it's all depends on a sort of a case-by-case basis. So, for instance, if you have a purpose-built facility, whether it's in the agricultural area or industrial area, my understanding, and I'm just using this as a bit of a caveat, my understanding is that there's little to no odor. The issues come when, say, you have a greenhouse that's been retroactively approved to, say, that was originally for flowers or tomatoes or any sort of crop, and then the crop's changed, and then, say, the ventilation hasn't been upgraded. And I know my understanding is that people have experienced odor impacts, you know, several days, you know, throughout an entire season. Outdoor growing, again, is different because it depends on the growing conditions, the weather, so on, and you know, the wind. So I don't have specific data on that, because, and it all depends on the receptor. So someone might have be more sensitive to smells than others, and so it just depends on a number of different factors.
Follow up?
Follow up?
There, I find that to be, you know, a lot of relevance here. Like, for instance, I'm a farmer myself, but if I was spreading pig manure, or I was spraying chicken manure or whatever, you know, the smell is pretty strong there for a day or so, but after that, it's gone. But we're in a rural municipality. There's a lot of farming here. I know there's going to be a lot of interest in that. So I think the length of time and the odor and all that is something that we need to look at. I have another question, Mayor Allen, if I can shoot it to Mr. Bender.
Go ahead.
You mentioned about industrial use, and that is another thing too. Like, how is industrial use? Like, there's the growing of it, and then there's the production of it, and like, it's like a guy along the road growing corn, or somebody growing producing maple syrup in the springtime. Like that maple syrup producer, he taps the trees, he boils it, he sells it at the uh, this 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 thing about cannabis. Is there something stopping you from being able to grow a crop, and being able to produce it and sell it? Uh, what's the reason? Are you going to be allowed to do that? I'm not in favor of an industrial taxation, because if it's zoned industrial, you get an industrial tax. This is about agriculture and about growing, and that's something that I could see if it's a mammoth sized production facility like we see next door in Clearview, but something that's roadside, that's something I have a concern about. Can you elaborate any more on that?
Through your worship to Councillor Ritchie again. So I only use that as an example because that's how some municipalities are and where they're directing certain uses. It often be, depending on what's happening, if it's merely production, that certainly is occurring in some industrial areas across the province. There are some instances where some growing is happening as well as part of industrial areas. But on the other side of that, it's certainly happening in the agricultural area. Certainly there are provisions in place throughout the province that would allow growing and production on the same property. We're just starting sort of this particular project with the township, so I don't want to necessarily bias anyone's thoughts as to where we're going to go, because we do want to have a very locally specific solution for the township. But just so you're aware, it is happening in both areas, but it just depends on where the municipality would prefer to direct it. I can appreciate that it's hard to argue it's an agricultural use if it's being permitted in the employment area, just as an example.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment. I hope that this study will allow Springwater to be proactive rather than reactive and have effective control during the interim control bylaw period over the next year, and thereafter through bylaws controlling the growing of hemp or cannabis in the township, including where it can be grown, the physical setup, and the planning and other rules under which it is grown and harvested. You said in the presentation that this is filling the gap in direction, and that's what it is. Between the federal government and provincial government, there is a gap. So these Part 2 facilities, as opposed to the Part 1s that are heavily regulated, but the Part 2 facilities or the medical marijuana registrations don't have the same degree of control. So a lot of municipalities are playing catch up because they have existing Part 2 facilities that are close to residential areas and they haven't had the bylaws or interim control bylaws, so they're playing catch up to try to create those with existing facilities. We don't have an existing facility that grows cannabis of any significance to this point in time. So I hope that this study produces a roadmap to allow us to create the clean, safe property bylaw amendments and the site plan control amendments with respect to lighting and ventilation, the odor control bylaw necessary changes, and the municipal licensing. And also looks to enforcement considerations to make sure these bylaws that are put in place are adhered to. And I would hope from this study that we would also have suggested approaches to the government, provincially and federally, to promote cooperation and clarity in the establishment of the rules that seem to be somewhat devoid in this area. Do you have any thoughts with respect to that, Mr. Bender?
Thank you, Your Worship. Very well said. I would agree with everything that you've said. We're certainly, we've been retained to look at your existing planning framework. So our recommendations are largely going to guide your official plan, your zoning bylaw, and any other tools that could be implemented to help guide cannabis production in the municipality. certainly as part of our best practices review, and certainly as part of any sort of overarching recommendations, I'm sure we could figure something out to help guide the municipality. But as it relates, our direct recommendations are primarily serving your planning framework.
Councillor Cabral.
Oh, thank you, Mayor Allen. I think there is a bit of a distinction between the medicinal marijuana. I think for the most part, I don't think the issues and concerns regarding those, because my opinion would be they'd be more of a laboratory type of setting, doing extractions and whatnot for CBD oil and things like that. But I know the odor is one of the items that would present some difficulty. And I guess my question here, it might be for Director Spagnol, but obviously Mr. Bender might be able to answer it too. When we're looking at implementing guidelines and rules for the industrial versus the agricultural, and I have to relate back to what Councillor Ritchie said, because it was playing on my mind when I think about a place like Miller Dairy, where a lot of farmers might start off just in the initial phase of production, but then some of them continue to build on that and then eventually produce also the finished product. And I'm wondering, on the agricultural side, would we still be able to regulate it in the same manner we would, say, if somebody went over to an industrial area, say on Bertram Drive, built a handful of greenhouses, and they were going to cultivate marijuana in that setting on industrial land? So I'm kind of wondering how that would work if a farmer wanted to grow it and then instead of selling it to somebody else to process and package, opted to continue that process right through to the end. How would they be regulated? It would still be different from the industrial zoning. I guess that's a question for Mr. Spagnol, Director Spagnol.
Director Spagnol.
Thank you, Mayor Allen, through you to Councillor Cabral. Really, I mean, the essence of this study will be to define and take a look at what might be appropriate in each specific zone with respect to the production of cannabis. So that's something that will have to definitely be looked at through the study. There will have to be recommendations that take a look at maybe scale of operation in the agricultural zone if council wants to consider having some sort of a production facility for processing. So ultimately, that is something that needs to be considered as part of the study and will need to be considered prior to us bringing forward any implementation mechanisms such as zoning bylaw amendments and site plan control. So it's those types of considerations that we want to hear from council on with respect to this, so that it can better guide the study and provide appropriate recommendations based on what council wants us to consider.
Okay.
Mr. Bender,
Thank you.
did you want to, sorry, was there another point? I don't see any hands. Did you want to talk about the survey a bit more?
Thank you, Your Worship, and certainly to echo what Director Spagnol said, I agree fully with what he said. And again, I think for the most part, we would like to get that that input from council. Because again, we don't want to put a sort of a blanket approach across the township, because we need to really react to this, as mentioned by yourself, proactively, but also on a locally specific basis. So if you would permit me, I'm happy to walk council through some of the questions so we can get some specific feedback tonight. Again, I don't want to assume that tonight is the last time to provide input. If there's any particular input that anyone would like to provide after the meeting, I would urge you to do so. You're welcome to provide that to Director Spagnol, and he can convey that information to ourselves.
Okay, proceed, please.
Okay, thank you. So I think we've talked a lot as it relates to a number of the different questions, and one of the things that I want to hear, and I think we want to hear from members of council, are what are the concerns that you have? What are the concerns that you're hearing related to cannabis production? Is it primarily odor? Is it something else? I'd be curious to know.
Certainly, I have heard odor, and certainly in the examples that I've heard from Oro Medonte down in Norfolk, down in Essa, down in Bradford, West Gwillimbury, it's a constant odor, and it's a very oppressive odor. So the odor aspect, the security aspect, the lack of setback, so the proximity to other residences, the noise aspect, and the generators going, the lights going. It just it begs to have rules and regulations with respect to operations, not that prevent it from operating, but control it and where it should be operated, and so that it doesn't have adverse impact on surrounding residences.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Other comments, councillors?
Okay.
Certainly, we'll review the questions. You saw the bus that happened down in Niagara Region on the weekend that was reported, or over the recent past, that was reported in the press, and I distributed that to council. And you hear of similar sorts of facilities in the townships that I mentioned. So, I'm in contact with them as are other councillors, and hearing this, and we're hearing it increasingly from residents in the township, a concern that it doesn't happen in Springwater. So, what are we doing to shore up whatever we have to shore up to prevent it from happening here? So we'll review certainly your questions and provide further input. Director Spagnell?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. One thing that staff, just to try to paint a picture as to what the next steps look like with respect to the survey. After council reviews the questions that are being posed, staff would like to have the survey put online and available for public input by September 1st or early September, with the expectation to leave that open and available for comment right up until the end of September. Just want to gauge council's interest, whether that's an appropriate time frame and an adequate time period to receive comment. And at least that way that gives council a couple of days to consider some additional questions that council may want to see included in the survey.
We always hear feedback about it just being online and the reach that has or doesn't have to the residents. So what other ways of informing and trying to gather survey results would be considered, Director Spagnell?
Thank you, Mayor. Under normal circumstances, we provide for, hard copy surveys to be filled out in those types of avenues. However, given the situation, the way things are today, we're somewhat limited. So what we would do is we would work with our communications team to push the surveys out to Springwater residents, maybe through social media and through our township-wide media avenues, to try to push it out to gain some feedback. What we've experienced when we've done this for specifically with respect to backyard chickens is that we had some pretty good response from the standpoint of just using the social media tools that are available to us. So that's how we would do that. I could go and discuss that further with our communications team as to how we could best push out that survey.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ritchie, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. Through to Director Spagnell, I just like to point out that we're moving into the into September here soon, and a harvest is going to be upon the farmers soon, and harvest is always a busy time. I'm sure they'll always take the time, but I guess what I'm trying to say is the sooner these questionnaires are put out to the public to allow especially the farmers to respond in kind to the ideas that or the questions that they would have, so we could get them answered. So I guess what I'm trying to say, the sooner the better. So, thank you.
Councillor Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Sorry I disappeared there. I'm one of those people that's technologically disadvantaged when it comes to internet connections. Just with respect to the questionnaire, I think it's question number 5. I really don't know how a resident would answer that particular question. I think it needs more context. Which use should cannabis production facilities be considered under? Are we talking about recreational versus medicinal, I guess would be my question on that. So I'm just kind of saying that particular question might want to be rethought. Just to make it a little bit clearer for residents who are going to be answering that, because I think that's a pretty tough one for them to determine under what use it should be considered. And my other comment I wanted to make is we did kind of rush into this, and I'm just know that we have this, and I'm going to say that the interim bylaw and moratorium is being used interchangeably, Director Spagnol, because you've used the term moratorium, and I'm wondering if that's in reference to the interim bylaw.
Director Spagnol?
Thank you, Mayor Allen, through you to Councilor Cabral. Yes, you're correct. I'm using them interchangeably. The moratorium is really referring to the interim control bylaw.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And just a follow up on that particular one, I did do a little bit of review there, and I think we kind of, rushed into this because we felt like we were, for lack of a better use of words, under the gun to get something moving so that we could implement the interim bylaw. But it's also my understanding that council merely has to vote to extend it, and it can be extended by an additional year. I don't know if that was brought to council's attention at the time, but I want to know if that's correct or am I incorrect in that particular thought?
Before I turn to Director Spagnol, I believe that was discussed at the time, Councillor Cabral. It's not appealable in the first year, is my understanding. It is able to be extended, but is appealable in the second year. But I'll turn that to Director Spagnol. I think we did discuss that at the time. Director Spagnol?
Yep. Thank you, Mayor Allen. You are correct. Yes.
Okay. You're on mute, Councillor Cabral. You're muted there. Okay, maybe that's, there we go. Did you have anything further, Councillor Cabral? I saw your lips moving, but we couldn't hear you.
No, I apologize. I'm having issues at my end here, but no, you did answer my question. If that was the reason behind it was because it was appealable, that's all.
Thank you. Okay, anything else then at this point? So we will get comments written to Director Spagnol if you have any with respect to this presentation and or the survey questions, and we'll move forward with that post haste. Okay, so thank you for the presentation and for the discussion, Mr. Bender and Council. So can I have a mover or seconder to confirm and adopt the proceedings of Council, please? Oh, Councillor, Clerk Ainsworth.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. The motion to receive the presentation has not been voted on.
Okay, we didn't vote on it. Okay, we had a mover and a seconder. Okay, that the presentation from WSP regarding cannabis production review study, initial findings be received. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you. And a mover and a seconder for confirming and adopting the proceedings of Council. Councillor Cabral, Councillor Ritchie, that bylaw 2020-061 to confirm and adopt proceedings of Council at the special meeting held on August 24, 2020, listed herein, be signed and sealed by the Mayor and Clerk. All those in favor? Carried. And mover and seconder to adjourn this special meeting, please. Councillor Moore and Councillor Ritchie, that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 5:55 p.m. to meet again at a regular meeting on September 2nd at 6:30 p.m. in the Council Chambers, Admin Centre, Minising. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Bender.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.